Tonight, on the fourth floor of Brackwater Naval Convalescent Center, a woman who empties the sharps bins after the day shift goes home is about to be handed a life that 4 doctors have already given up on, and she is going to take it without asking anyone's permission. The physicians call her the night nurse, as if the word were a demotion. The administrators call her a liability because she does not smile in the direction of cameras. The visiting families call her furniture, useful and silent and easy to walk past. Only the old man who keeps the boilers running has another name for her, and when they laugh at her, he says the same thing every time, low to no one. Still water, that's all he says. Still water. She keeps her sleeves down in a building where everyone else rolls theirs up. She speaks so quietly that people lean in and resent leaning. She counts things nobody has asked her to count. Now the elevator is rising with a man on a gurney whose eyes are open and fixed on the ceiling and whose hand, resting on the blanket, is tapping, 3 short, 3 long, a pause, a shape no one in that hallway can read, except her. Before we go any further, I want to say welcome and thank you for being here. If this story reaches you tonight, do me one small favor and tap the like button, not for me, but so it finds the next person who needs to hear that quietness is not the same thing as weakness. Subscribe if you want to sit with more stories like this one, because this is a place for people who pay attention. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. I read them. I tell these stories because I grew up around people whose worth nobody bothered to measure, and I have never stopped wanting to measure it out loud. Odette Marsh had worked the night rotation at Brackwater for 6 years, and in 6 years she had not once told anyone what she used to be. She arrived at 1900 before the day staff left, and she stayed until the light came gray off the harbor and touched the far wall of the ward. She wore her cardigan buttoned in July. She wore her hair pinned so tight it looked painted on. When a monitor alarmed at the far end of the corridor, she was moving toward it before the second beat, and no one ever noticed that she had started before the sound finished, because noticing her was not a habit anyone at Brackwater had bothered to form. The building itself was old Navy, brick and salt and long windows that rattled when the weather came in off the water. On the wall of the 4th floor lounge hung a framed set of institutional values in gold letters: dignity, vigilance, presence. Nobody read them. They had hung there so long they had become part of the paint. Dr. Bram Pell read them aloud sometimes during teaching rounds, in the voice of a man quoting scripture he had written himself. Pell was the chief of the neurological service, and he was, by every measure that mattered on paper, brilliant. He had trained at the best programs. He published. He wore a watch that cost more than Odette made in 3 months, and he checked it during other people's sentences. When he walked the floor, a small tail of residents walked behind him, and one of them, a soft-faced young nurse named Fen Sato, laughed at everything Pell said a half-second before the joke landed, because being liked by Pell felt like standing near a fire in a cold building. That evening, Pell stopped at the medication cart where Odette was reconciling a count, and he picked up the chart she had just annotated, and he held it out at arm's length as if it smelled. "Miss Marsh," he said. His voice carried. It was built to carry. "You have written that this patient's respiratory rate was labored at 0200. Labored. You are aware that labored is not a number. You are aware that we are a scientific institution and not a fishing village." Odette said nothing. "I only ask," Pell went on, "because when a person cannot advance past a certain level of training, the language starts to give them away. We use precise language here. We chart in the tongue of medicine, not in feelings." The residents smiled at their shoes. Fen Sato laughed her half-second laugh. Down the hall, another nurse named Priya Ren, who was good at her job and knew it, watched from a doorway and did not laugh, but did not speak either, and the not speaking cost her nothing yet, and she knew that too. 22, Odette said. Pell blinked. What? Respiratory rate 22 rising with accessory muscle use and a 2-second pause on expiration. I charted the number in the vitals column where the number goes. Labored is what I told the on-call, so he would come. He did not come. For a moment something moved behind Pell's eyes, the flicker of a man who has just been handed the correct answer by the wrong person. Then he set the chart down as if it had disappointed him. "Get some rest, Miss Marsh," he said. "You seem tired. Tired people reach." He walked on. The residents flowed after him. Fen Sato glanced back once, half apology, half relief that it had not been her, and then she was gone too. Odette finished her count. Her hands did not shake. Her hands never shook when everything around her was shaking, and that, more than anything, was the thing about her that no one at Brackwater had thought to wonder about. Then the elevator at the end of the corridor opened, and 2 transport techs rolled in a gurney with an old man on it, and the chart taped to the rail read Voss Calder, and under it the single word Admiral, and the old man's eyes were open and aimed at the ceiling, and his right hand was tapping the blanket in a pattern that meant nothing to anyone in that building, and Odette Marsh, 6 years silent, went very still. They had brought her a ghost, and none of them knew it. The Admiral had come to Brackwater to die quietly. That was not written anywhere, but it was in every line of the transfer packet. A hemorrhagic stroke 14 months earlier had left him with what the sending facility called a profound and global impairment. He did not track. He did not respond to voice. He did not follow commands. He breathed on his own, and his heart kept its own counsel. And beyond that, the paperwork said, there was no one home. Dr. Pell read the packet in the lounge the next morning while Odette was still on, doing the overlap she was not paid for. He read it the way a man reads a menu he has already decided about. Locked in, he said, and then corrected himself, because precision was his religion. No, not even locked in. Locked in implies a mind behind the door. This is an empty room with the lights left on. We will keep him comfortable, and we will not waste the imaging suite on a man who cannot benefit from it. Greer Ledoux was in the lounge too, and Ledoux was always in the lounge when there was a sentence to be turned into a policy. Ledoux ran the administrative side of the 4th floor and carried a tablet the way other people carry a small dog, close to the body, angled away from strangers. Ledoux nodded at Pell's words and typed them into the tablet, and just like that, a man became a category. Odette stood at the counter with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, and she watched the Admiral through the glass of his room across the hall. His hand was tapping again. It tapped when a nurse came near, and it stopped when the room was empty, and no one had charted that, because to chart it you would first have to believe it meant something. She went in on her break, which she was also not paid for. She checked his lines out of habit, adjusted the angle of his head to protect his airway, and she leaned down close to straighten the blanket, and his eyes came off the ceiling and found her face. Not the drift of a blind man. The aim of a gunner. His hand tapped, 3 short, 3 long. A pause, then a long, a short, a long, and again, and she read it without deciding to, the way you read your own name in a crowd. 2 letters, R2, and then a word she had not let herself say in 20 years, spelled slow and steady against the cotton by a man the entire building had written off as furniture. Reaper, 2. She did not gasp. She did not step back. Her face did not change at all, and that was the discipline of it, the thing she had built herself into over 2 decades, the ability to hold a detonation behind her teeth. But her hand found the edge of the bed rail and held it, and under her sleeve the old scar along her forearm pulled tight the way it did in cold water, and somewhere very far down, 20 years and an ocean away, A rotor was still turning. "You are in here," she said, very low, only for him. His hand tapped once. "Yes." She straightened. Across the hall, through 2 panes of glass, Fen Sato was watching her stand too close to the empty room, with the lights left on, and Fen filed it away as the kind of thing Dr. Pell would want to know about. The night nurse talking to a vegetable. The night nurse who reached. Odette walked out of the room and washed her hands for a long time and did not look at herself in the mirror over the sink. Under her cardigan, in the inside pocket she had sewn there herself, was a dive watch with a cracked crystal and a bezel fused by heat, stopped at 11 minutes past 4, and she had carried it for 20 years and had never once wound it, and for the first time since she had pulled it off a dead man's wrist, her hand went to it and pressed it flat against her ribs. She did not wind it, not yet, but she felt it there ticking with her heart instead of its own, and she went back to work and she said nothing to anyone, and the word he had spelled sat in her chest, like a coal that would not go out. The next 3 nights, she watched him, and he watched her. She learned the shape of him fast, the way she had once learned the shape of wounded men in the dark by touch alone. His left side was gone, slack and unanswering. His right hand worked barely, enough to tap. His eyes tracked. When she read to him from the tide charts in the day-old newspaper, because she did not know what else to read and the sea seemed right, his breathing slowed and steadied, and his monitor smoothed out into long, clean hills. When Pell entered the room, his heart rate climbed 9 beats and stayed there until Pell left. She charted all of it. She charted it in numbers because numbers were the tongue they respected, and she left the numbers where Pell would see them. He did not see them, or he saw them and did not believe them, which at Brackwater was the same thing. On the 4th night, the Admiral's numbers went wrong. It started small, the way the worst things start. His face flushed on the working side and stayed pale on the dead side, a hard line drawn down the center of him. His blood pressure, which she took herself because the tech had gone to break, read 190/110 and then 210, and his heart, which should have raced to match, slowed instead, 60, then 54, then 48, and a bead of sweat stood out above his working eyebrow, while the rest of him stayed dry as paper. Odette knew what it was before the second reading finished. Autonomic dysreflexia, a body with its wiring cut, screaming through the only channels left to it, a blocked catheter or a pressure sore or a bent line somewhere below, the level of the injury sending the blood pressure toward the ceiling and the heart toward the floor. And if it climbed unchecked, it would burst a vessel in the brain of a man who had already lost half of one that way. She hit the call light. She raised the head of the bed. She loosened everything binding him and began at his feet and worked up, hunting the trigger. And she sent Priya Wren to page the on-call physician, and the on-call physician was Bram Pell. And Bram Pell arrived in the doorway with his coat still buttoned and his hands in his pockets, and he looked at the man he had already filed away, and he did not come in. Blood pressure 220/120, Odette said. Bradycardic at 44. This is dysreflexia. He needs the trigger found and the pressure down now. He has no functional cord below the neck to speak of, Pell said. He cannot mount a dysreflexic response. What you are describing is not possible in this patient. Recheck your cuff. 225, she said, reading it live. 42. Pell's hands came out of his pockets, and one of them, she saw, was not quite steady. He hid it by folding his arms. You are frightening the staff with a machine artifact, he said. Do not treat a number you do not understand. Recheck the cuff, sit him up, and page me if there is a genuine change. There is a genuine change, she said. It is happening now. Miss Marsh. His voice dropped into the register he used for the last word. You do not diagnose, you do not order. You are a nurse. If you touch that patient with anything other than a blood pressure cuff, I will have you removed from this floor tonight." "Am I understood?" The monitor said 40. The monitor said 2:30. Fen Sato stood behind Pell in the hall, with her hand over her mouth. Priya Ren stood in the doorway with the phone still in her hand and made her choice, which was to say nothing, and Odette saw all of them in one flat sweep, and then she stopped seeing them. She turned her back on the doctor in the doorway and she went to work. She found it in 90 seconds. A kinked drainage line pinned under the man's hip, a bladder swollen tight as a drum, the body's alarm bell ringing through the only nerves it had left. She freed the line. Urine ran, and the drum went soft, and she watched the number and counted under her breath. The old count, the one she had done 100 times in a shaking aircraft, with the deck pitching under her knees. 2:30, 2:20. She had him upright, legs down, every constriction gone. 200, 180. His heart heard the pressure fall and climbed to meet it. 48, 56, 66. The hard color line down the center of his face began to blur back toward one man. 150/90, she said to the room, to the record, to no one. Heart rate 72. Resolved. Behind her, silence. Then Pell's voice, and it had changed, thinned, because he had watched a nurse be right in front of his residence about a thing he had declared impossible, and the only weapon he had left was the one he was best with. "Ledoux," he said, without turning his head, "bring an incident form." The suspension came in writing, because at Brackwater, everything that mattered came in writing. Slower than blood, but harder to stop once it started. Greer Ledoux delivered it the next evening at the start of Odette's shift, in the lounge, under the gold letters that said dignity and vigilance and presence. Ledoux held the tablet at the usual angle and read from it in the usual voice, the one with no person in it. Effective immediately pending review, Odette Marsh is placed on administrative suspension for practicing outside her scope, for refusing a direct instruction from the attending physician of record, and for undertaking an intervention on a patient over the express objection of that physician. Ledoux looked up. "This is not about whether the patient did well," Ledoux said. "This is about liability. If the patient had died, this institution would have been indefensible. We protect the institution. That is the job." "He did not die," Odette said. "He is sitting up. He is tracking. Go and look." "We are not litigating outcomes," Ledoux said. "We are litigating process. Your process was insubordinate. Please surrender your badge and your access fob. You will be escorted to the exit." Security came, 2 young men who did not want to be there, and they stood on either side of a small, quiet woman as if she might bolt, and they walked her the length of the 4th-floor corridor toward the elevator. And that was where the building surprised itself, because the corridor was not empty. Word travels in a hospital at night the way water travels downhill, and along both walls of that long corridor, without anyone having organized it, the night staff had come out of their rooms. Nurses and aides and a respiratory tech and 2 orderlies stood against the walls with their arms at their sides and watched her go by, and not one of them said a word. And their silence was not the old silence, the walk-past silence, the furniture silence. It was the other kind. It was the kind that has weight. Tobias Cuff, who kept the boilers running and had no business on the 4th floor at that hour, stood at the very end by the elevator with his cap in his hands. He was old enough to have known the building when it was still a working Navy hospital, and he had hands like knotted rope and a face like a piling. And when Odette reached him, he put his cap back on, and he said the thing he always said, but this time he said it to the security guards, and to Ledoux, and to the whole watching hall. "You are throwing out the only real sailor in the building," he said. "You just can't tell, because still water don't advertise how deep it runs." Nobody answered him. Nobody ever answered him. The elevator came. Odette stepped in, and as the doors began to close, she looked back down the corridor, past all the silent faces, to the glass wall of room 412, where an old man had somehow gotten his working hand up off the blanket and was holding it there in the air, 3 fingers spread, the ghost of a salute from a body that could no longer make one. The doors closed on it. She sat in her car in the lot for a long time and did not start it, and the harbor lay flat and black beyond the seawall, and the past came up the way it always came up, in pieces without permission, the smell of jet fuel on water. That first. Always that first. Then the cold, the particular cold of the North Atlantic in a survival suit that has already torn cold, that is not temperature but a hand around the lungs. Then the sound, the enormous grinding sound of a transport aircraft folding itself into the sea, and the red of the strobe on her helmet stuttering across black waves and men in the water, 6 of them, then 5, and her own voice screaming a name into a throat mic that was already full of salt. She swallowed it. She had gotten very good at swallowing it. She put both hands on the wheel and made them be still, and she breathed the way she had taught herself to breathe. 4 in, hold 4 out, until the rotor faded and the harbor was just a harbor again. She had been Reaper too. That was the thing the whole story turned on, and the thing she had buried so deep that hearing it tapped out on a blanket had nearly stopped her heart. She had been a rescue swimmer and a flight medic on a search and rescue crew, and Reaper was the crew and she was the 2 of it. And there had been a night 20 years ago off a coast she never named when a Navy transport went down in weather that should have grounded everyone, and Reaper had launched anyway, because there were men in the water, and that is what Reaper was for. She had pulled 5 men out of that sea with her own hands. 5. She counted them still, every night, 5, the way you count change, and she had gone back for the 6th, gone down into the black one more time against every rule of the work, and she had not found him in time, and she had surfaced with empty arms and a dead man's watch. She had grabbed off a floating wrist in the dark, thinking it was still attached to someone she could save. Reaper 1, the pilot, Ansel Rook, the man who had flown her into that storm and told her, on the way out, that she was the best in the fleet and he would put his life in her hands any day of the week. And then his life had been in her hands, and she had come up without it, and she had spent 20 years being certain, with the flat, cold certainty that never once loosened, that she had chosen wrong in the dark, that she had pulled the last stranger she could reach instead of finding her way to him, that Ansel Rook had drowned 6 feet from a woman who was busy saving someone else. She had never told anyone. She had left the Navy with a chest full of medals she kept in a drawer face down. She had come inland, and then she had come back to the water because she could not stay away from it, and she had taken the quietest job in the quietest building on the coast and made herself furniture on purpose, because furniture cannot fail anyone. Furniture cannot come up with empty arms. She took the fused watch out of her pocket and held it in the dark of the car. 11 minutes past 4, the moment the cold had stopped it. She had never wound it because winding it felt like lying, like telling that night it was over when it was not over, and she put it back against her ribs and started the car and drove home and did not sleep. She did not know yet that the man in room 412 had been in that same water. She did not know that the message was already tapping its way toward her. 3 short, 3 long, night after night, from the only living witness to the last thing Ansel Rook ever did. She came back 4 days later because Tobias Cuff called her and told her to. He did not explain. He said only that there was a car coming to Brackwater in the morning that she would want to be inside the building to see, and that a person could visit a hospital even when the hospital had thrown her out, and that if she had any sense left, after all that salt, she would put on clean clothes and come stand in the lobby and wait. Then he hung up because Tobias did not believe in long calls. She went. She stood in the lobby in a coat instead of a cardigan, badgeless, just a woman waiting, and at 10 in the morning a government car pulled up under the portico, and a woman in dress blues got out, and the whole lobby seemed to straighten without knowing why. Vice Admiral Neve Delacroix was small and square and moved without hurry, and she had the kind of quiet that other quiet people recognize across a room. She had come, the front desk would later say, on a routine matter, a wellness check on a flag officer in long-term care, the Navy keeping track of its own. But she had also come because a nurse she had never met had written a letter 3 days earlier before she was walked out, a plain letter to a naval liaison office describing a patient who was conscious and communicating and being charted as empty, and that letter had crossed a desk that knew the name Voss, and things had begun to move that no tablet could stop. Odette had not signed the letter with any rank. She had signed it night nurse. Delacroix asked for the neurological service and was taken up, and by the time she reached the 4th floor, Bram Pell had been alerted, and Pell met her in the corridor, outside room 412, in a fresh coat with his residence arranged behind him, and Greer Ledoux beside him holding the tablet like a shield, and the whole floor drifted out again to watch, because they could feel the weather changing the way old sailors feel it in their knees. "Admiral," Pell said, warmly, expansively, "it is an honor. I wish the circumstances were happier. As you will see from the record, Admiral Voss suffered a catastrophic event that has left him without meaningful cognitive function. We have kept him comfortable and dignified. We follow him closely." Delacroix looked through the glass at the old man in the bed. The old man was looking back at her. His hand was tapping. "Who charted the tapping?" Delacroix said. Pell smiled. "That is an involuntary motor artifact, Admiral. A reflex. We see it often. It has no communicative content." Delacroix walked into the room. She did not ask permission. She pulled a chair to the bedside and sat where the old man could see her, and she watched his hand for a while. And then she said quietly, to a man half the building had declared absent, "Reaper, actual. This is Delacroix. Report." And Calder Voss began to tap, and Neve Delacroix read it aloud, letter by letter, in the flat voice of someone reading a signal off a page, and the corridor went silent enough to hear the harbor. He tapped that he was Admiral Calder Voss. He tapped his service number. He tapped that his mind was intact and his body was not, and that he had spent 14 months in a room being spoken about as though he were dead. He tapped that one nurse had spoken to him as a man. He tapped her name. He tapped that they had removed her. Then Delacroix stood, and she turned to face the corridor, and she found the small, badgeless woman standing at the back of the crowd, and something crossed the Admiral's face that was not on any chart. "You," Delacroix said, "come here." Odette came. And Neve Delacroix, who never raised her voice because she had never in her life needed to, began to recite a record. Not the Admiral's, Odette's, Petty Officer First Class. "Odette Marsh," she said, "rescue swimmer, air crew survival, fleet search and rescue." She said the name of a squadron and the name of a coast. She said the date of a night 20 years gone, and at the sound of the date, Odette's face finally moved. One small crack quickly closed. "Call sign Reaper 2, Delacroix said. On the night in question, in weather that had grounded every other asset in the region, this sailor deployed 6 times into open water from an aircraft that had no business flying and recovered 5 survivors of a downed transport and was awarded the Navy Cross, which she declined to appear in uniform to receive. The corridor did not breathe. Fen Sato had both hands over her mouth. Priya Wren had gone the color of the wall. Greer Ledoux's tablet hung forgotten at the end of one arm. Bram Pell said, into the silence, in a voice that had lost its carry, "That cannot be the same person." Delacroix turned her head slowly toward him, the way a lighthouse turns. "Doctor," she said, You have spent 4 days explaining to a rescue swimmer why she is not qualified to save a life. I would stop now. And in the bed, Calder Voss lifted his one working hand, and he did not tap. He reached across 2 feet of air toward the woman who had pulled 5 men out of the sea and hated herself for the 6th, and his fingers closed around nothing and held it. What came out over the following week was not a single crime. It was a habit that had grown a skeleton. Delacroix stayed. She did not shout, and she did not threaten, and she did not need to, because she brought people with clipboards of their own. And clipboards are the only thing an institution truly fears, and they began quietly reading the 4th floor's records back to it. The picture that assembled itself was uglier than cruelty, because cruelty at least is honest about being cruelty. Bram Pell had built his reputation on outcomes, and outcomes are a number, and a number can be managed 2 ways. You can make the sick well, which is hard, or you can make the sick disappear from your denominator, which is easy. For years, quietly, with the language of precision, Pell had been reclassifying his most damaged and least profitable patients as beyond meaningful recovery, and once a patient wore that label, they were withdrawn from active therapy, moved to comfort measures, and counted out of the statistics that his reputation and his research funding fed on. A conscious patient who could recover was expensive. A conscious patient who might recover slowly and imperfectly was a threat to a clean curve. Calder Voss had been exactly that threat. A flag officer with a family and a navy behind him, a man whose recovery would have to be attempted in full view, a man whose slow, imperfect climb back would sit on Pell's outcomes like a stone. Far cleaner to declare him empty, far cleaner to file him under comfort and let the numbers stay smooth. And Greer-Ledoux had helped, not out of malice, but out of the deeper thing, the institutional reflex to protect the institution from the truth about itself, to turn every human problem into a liability problem and then solve the liability problem instead of the human one. Ledoux had signed the reclassifications because Pell was the expert, and experts are what you defer to, and had suspended the one nurse who noticed, because a nurse who notices is a documentation risk. It was Priya Wren who broke first, and she broke by working. She did not make a speech. She went into the old records at night, the way Odette used to go into rooms, and she pulled every chart of every patient Pell had filed under beyond meaningful recovery in 3 years, and she laid them out and cross-checked them against therapy notes and family complaints and the small buried observations of aides who had written things like, "Patient squeezed my hand and been ignored." And she built a stack, and she brought the stack to Delacroix without being asked, and she said only, "I laughed once." On the medication cart, I wanted on the record that I laughed once, and then I want to be useful. Delacroix looked at the stack and looked at the woman and said, "Noted, keep going." That was all, not forgiveness, a task. Priya took it and went back to work and did not ask for more, and that was the beginning of her earning a nod she would not fully receive for a year. Fen Sato did not break so cleanly. Fen came to Odette in the stairwell, where people at Brackwater went to say true things, and Fen cried and said she was sorry, that she had told Dr. Pell about Odette talking to the empty room, that she had wanted him to like her, that she had not understood. Odette listened. She did not comfort her, and she did not condemn her. "You told him because you wanted to be safe," Odette said. "There is no such thing as safe on the outside of what is right. You will figure that out, or you will not. Wash your hands and go check on 410. Her sats were soft at midnight." Fen went. It was not absolution. It was the closest thing to it that a person like Odette had left to give, which was a task and a door held open a few inches, and whether Fen Sato walked through it was going to be up to Fen Sato, and the story would not tie that bow, because that bow does not tie in real life. Bram Pell, through all of it, kept coming to work. That was the strange thing, the thing Odette watched with something close to pity. He put on his coat and he walked his rounds, and his tale of residence did not walk behind him anymore, and he read the gold letters on the wall aloud to no one. Dignity, vigilance, presence, and his hands, she noticed, had begun to tremble even when nothing was required of them. He was intelligent enough to understand exactly what was happening to him. That was the cruelty the situation did to him that no person had to. He could feel each supporting beam pulled out one at a time, and he could do the structural math, and he knew what the building of his life was going to do, and he had to keep standing inside it while it came down slow. And then, on a Thursday, before any of it could finish, the weather came in off the harbor, and the power failed, and the fourth floor of Brackwater filled up with everything that had been coming. It was the tale of a storm that had not been forecast to hit, and it hit at 1940, and it took the shore power with it, and the emergency generator caught for 11 seconds and then failed too, because the generator had been on a deferred maintenance list that Ledoux had signed to protect the budget, and the whole fourth floor went dark and silent, except for the wind against the long windows and the sound of a dozen ventilators and pumps winding down at once. There were 9 patients on the floor who depended on machines to keep breathing or to keep their hearts in rhythm, and there were 4 staff on shift, and there was no attending in the building except Bram Pell, who was in his office, and there was, standing in the doorway of room 412 because she had come every night to sit with the Admiral whether they paid her or not, a badgeless suspended night nurse named Odette Marsh. The battery backups on the vents would last 90 minutes if nothing else drew them down. She knew that number without checking. She knew all the numbers. She stepped out of the doorway into the dark corridor, and she did not raise her voice, because she had never once in her life needed to, and she began to run the room. "Priya," she said, "bag the vents on manual, start at 416 and work toward me. 1 breath every 5 seconds. Count out loud so I can hear you from here. Fen, you are on lights, phones out, flashlights to me. Then you take pulses down the odd side and call me any heart rate under 50 or over 120 by name and number, nothing else. Tobias, the generator is deferred maintenance. You know that machine better than the men who signed the paper. Go and see if it is a fuel lock or a battery. You have got 30 minutes before the vent packs start to fade. Go." They went. Every one of them went in the dark, on the word of a woman with no badge, because the thing Delacroix's record could not do the storm did in an instant, which was to make every person on that floor understand in their spine that the calmest voice in the building belonged to the person who had done this before in worse conditions, with the deck moving under her. She moved down the corridor from bed to bed, and her hands were steady in the dark, and everyone else's shook, and that was the whole difference between her and the world. She found the failing hearts by touch. She talked to men who could not answer. She reached room 412, and Calder Voss was awake in the dark, with his monitor dead and his one hand tapping, calm, steady, and she put her hand flat on his chest and felt it rise on its own and said, "You are fine, Admiral. You breathe by yourself. You always did." And his hand tapped once against her wrist. Yes. And Bram Pell came out of his office. He came out into the dark corridor with a flashlight shaking in his hand, and he saw his floor being run without him by the woman he had walked to the elevator, and something in him, some last brave and broken thing, made him try. He went to the nearest patient, a man in cardiac failure whose external pacing had died with the power, and he knelt to place a manual line, and his hands, his brilliant trained hands, shook so badly in the beam of the flashlight that he could not thread it, could not, tried 3 times and could not, and he knelt there in the dark over a dying man, while the fine motor betrayed him completely, and he made a sound that no one at Brackwater had ever heard him make. Odette crossed to him. She could have let him kneel there. She could have moved him aside with one hand and done it herself, in front of everyone and let the whole floor watch the great man fail at the one thing. It would have finished him, and it would have been just, and no one would ever have said she was wrong. She knelt beside him instead, close so that only he could hear. "Bram," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. "Hold the flashlight, steady on my hands. That is the job now. Hold the light and count his pulse to me. I need a second set of eyes, and yours are the best in the building. Do that." And she took the line out of his shaking fingers, gently, the way you take something from a frightened person, and she threaded it herself while he held the light, and she let him believe, and she let the room believe, that they had done it together, and she gave him the count to call, so that his voice would have a use. And Bram Pell held a steady light over her steady hands, and understood, kneeling in the dark, that she had just handed him the one thing he had never once handed anyone, which was a way to still matter after you have already failed, and that mercy went into him deeper than any punishment could have reached, because he would have to live inside it now, remembering that when the power went out, the person who saved his dignity was the person whose dignity he had spent 4 days trying to take. The generator coughed and caught. Tobias Cuff had found a fuel lock and cleared it with a screwdriver, and 20 years of knowing where a machine hides its stubbornness. The lights came up. 9 patients breathed. Not one had been lost. And in the wash of returning light, Calder Voss was tapping, urgently now, over and over, and Odette went to him with fuel on her hands and blood on her sleeve, and she began to read, and this time the message was not a report. He tapped a date, her date, the night off the nameless coast. She went cold. "Admiral," she said, "don't." He tapped it again, and then he tapped a word, and the word was water, and then he tapped, "I was there." She did not understand at first. She could not let herself understand. She said, "You could not have been there," and he tapped, slow and certain, transport, and then he tapped 6, and then he tapped, "You pulled me," and the corridor, which had filled again with silent watchers, held its breath, and Odette Marsh, who had not cried in 20 years, felt her steady hands begin, at last, to shake. He had been the 6th man, not the one she failed, the one she found. She had gone back down into the black that final time, and her arms had closed on a body, and she had believed, surfacing, that it was Ansel Rook and that she had lost him, because the man she brought up was unconscious and did not answer and slid away from her onto another crew's litter in the chaos, and she never saw his face in the light. She had spent 20 years certain that her 6th dive was a failure that came up with a dead pilot's watch. It had not been Ansel. It had been a young lieutenant she pulled living from the sea, a lieutenant who woke 3 days later on a hospital ship, a lieutenant named Calder Voss. He tapped, and Delacroix, who had come running at the first alarm and now stood in the doorway, read it aloud so the whole corridor could hear, because he wanted it heard. He had waited 14 months and 20 years to have it heard. He tapped that he had been conscious in the water longer than anyone knew. He tapped that he had seen the pilot. He had seen Ansel Rook trapped in the cockpit as it went under, and he had seen the pilot wave the swimmer off, both arms, hard, the unmistakable order, "Go." And he had heard, through water and failing radio, the last transmission Reaper 1 ever sent, which was not a cry for help, which was 3 words, "Reaper 2 clear," and then the sea had closed over the aircraft, and the swimmer had turned and dived one more time, and pulled a dying stranger into the light instead. She never went back for him because he sent her away, Delacroix read. He read her wrong, so you would live. It was an order. She followed an order. Tell her. Odette stood with the Admiral's hand in both of hers, and 20 years came apart in her chest all at once, quietly, the way a great mass of ice lets go under water with no sound at the surface. She had not chosen wrong in the dark. She had not abandoned him. He had spent the last seconds of his life making sure she could not, had thrown away his own last chance of being reached so that his rescue swimmer would not die trying, and he had sent her his final thought not as grief but as a clearance. "Reaper 2 clear, you are released. You did it right." And she had never heard it because she was already going down, after the sixth man he had bought with his silence. She took the fused watch out of her pocket then, in front of all of them, and she looked at it for the first time in the light in 20 years, stopped at 11 minutes past 4, and she did the thing she had never let herself do. She wound it. Slowly, and the old spring caught, and the second hand shivered and began to move. "It's ticking," Tobias Cuff said, from the back to no one. Still water, finally moving. The aftermath was quieter than any of them expected, because the loud part had already happened in the dark, and everything after it was only paperwork, and paperwork is slower than blood, but it does, eventually, arrive. Brampell resigned before the review board could convene. He did not fight it. He wrote a short letter that mentioned no one and blamed no one, and asked only that his patients be transitioned with care. And he cleaned out his office on a Sunday when the floor was thin. And on his way to the elevator, he stopped at room 412, where Odette was sitting with the Admiral reading him the tide charts, and he stood in the doorway a moment with his coat over his arm. "I understood," he said, "that night. When you told me to hold the light, I understood exactly what you were doing." "I know you did," Odette said. "That was why it worked." He nodded, and his hands were still now, still because nothing was being asked of them, and he went to the elevator and was gone. And she felt no triumph watching him go, because the mercy she had shown him had cost her the clean pleasure of hating him, which was, she understood, the entire point of showing it. Some people you punish. Some people you hand a light to and let them carry the memory of who was holding it steady. The second is heavier. She had known that in the water 20 years ago, and she knew it in the corridor now. Greer Ledoux was reassigned and did not lose the job, because institutions do not eat their own that way, they only move them, and Ledoux would spend the rest of a career signing forms in a basement office and would never again decide who was beyond meaningful recovery, and that was as much justice as the building was built to produce, and Odette did not waste any of herself, wishing it were more. Knave Delacroix offered Odette the reward, because that is what the Navy does. It offers rewards. It is the language it has. She offered reinstatement with commendation. She offered a decoration to replace the one Odette had refused to appear for. She offered most of all a promotion into administration, a senior role, an office, a title, the chance to run things, to be the calm voice with the authority to match, to never be walked to an elevator again. Odette declined all of it. She sat across from the Vice Admiral in the thin morning light, off the harbor, and she declined the medal and the office and the rank. And Delacroix, who understood people, did not argue, only asked what Odette wanted instead, because a woman who declines everything usually wants one thing. "I want the thing that would have found the Admiral 14 months ago," Odette said. "Not me, a system that does not need me. Every long-term patient who cannot speak gets a communication assessment on admission by someone trained to look for the door instead of assuming there is no one behind it. Every reclassification to comfort measures gets a second signature from outside the service that benefits from the bed. And a night program, veteran to veteran, someone who has been in the water sitting with the ones who are still in it, so that no man lies in a bed for 14 months being talked about as if he were furniture. Build that. Put his name on it, not mine. They built it. They called it the Rook Protocol, after a pilot who waved a swimmer off so she would live. And it started at Brackwater, and then it did not stay at Brackwater, and years later there were nurses in hospitals 1,000 miles from any ocean who sat down beside silent patients and watched their hands and knew to ask, because a night nurse had refused a medal and asked for a system instead. Odette went back to nights. She would not take days. She said the ones who need finding get lost in the dark, so that is where she meant to work. She kept her sleeves down out of habit, but she stopped buttoning the cardigan in July. And when new staff asked Tobias Cuff who the quiet one on the 4th floor was, he told them the same thing he had always told them. Only now the whole building knew it was true. Calder Voss lived another 3 years. He never spoke aloud again, and he never needed to. He learned to run a small light board with his one hand, and he talked in Morse to anyone patient enough to learn it, and half the night staff learned it, because it turned out that once you know a thing can be reached, you find you have the time. He and Odette sat together most nights she worked, the pilot's watch ticking on her wrist now instead of stopped against her ribs, and they did not talk about the water. They had said the only thing about the water that mattered. He had told her she was clear. She had believed him. That was enough for 2 people who had already survived the worst weather of their lives. When he died, it was on a night shift, quietly, with his hand in hers, and the last thing he tapped, she told Delacroix afterward, was not goodbye. It was the old sign-off, the one from a night 20 years gone, given back to her whole, Reaper 2 clear, and she had sat with him until the gray light came off the harbor and touched the far wall, and then she had wound the watch one more turn and gone back to work. They tell the story wrong now, the way people always tell these stories wrong. They say a miracle woke a dead admiral. They say a hero nurse shouted down a cruel doctor. They leave out that no one shouted, that she never once raised her voice, that the whole thing turned on a woman who had trained herself out of noise, because noise is what you make before you have learned how much can be lost. She was not loud. She had simply already survived the thing the rest of them were only afraid of. She was still water. She was only ever, all along, deep water, moving under a surface that gave nothing away, carrying every drowned thing gently until the day it could be brought up into the light. If this one reached something in you, do that small thing and tap the like, so it finds the next person who has been treated like furniture in a room full of people who should have known better. Subscribe and stay, because the next story is about another quiet person the world underestimated, and I would like you here when the record gets read aloud. And tell me in the comments, honestly, which moment landed hardest, the mercy she gave the doctor in the dark, or the 3 words the pilot sent through the water, or the watch finally moving again, and tell me which of them you saw yourself in. I read every single comment. I always have. Still water. It runs deeper than you think. Years later, in a landlocked city where the nearest water was a reservoir behind a chain fence, a woman named Cora Ives sat down beside a man who had not been expected to notice anyone in 11 weeks, and she watched his hand. She had never met Odette Marsh. She had never seen the harbor at Brackwater or the long windows that rattled in a storm. She had only been trained in a 2-day course that was now required in her system, the way hand-washing was required, to assume there was a door before assuming there was a wall. She watched the man's fingers move against the sheet, small and without pattern, and she did not decide it meant nothing. She got a card with the alphabet on it. She got a colleague who knew the code. And on the 4th afternoon, the man tapped his daughter's name, and his daughter, who had stopped coming because there had seemed no one left to come for, came back that night and did not leave. Nobody told Odette about Cora Ives. There were too many of them by then to tell. That was the thing about building a system instead of a legend. A legend has your name on it and dies when you do. A system forgets you on purpose, spreads out past the reach of your knowing, and does its quiet work in rooms you will never enter, run by people who could not pick you out of a crowd. Odette had wanted it that way. She had asked for exactly that. She had asked for a machine that did not need her, and she had gotten one. And the price of getting it was that most of the lives it saved would never know she had existed, and she considered that price the lowest she had ever been asked to pay. At Brackwater, the fourth floor changed slowly, the way real things change, without a ribbon. The gold letters still hung in the lounge. Dignity, vigilance, presence. For a long time they had been part of the paint, words nobody read. And then something shifted, and people began to read them again, not because anyone made them, but because the floor had watched those words come true one night in the dark, and could no longer see them as decoration. Presence stopped meaning being in the building. It started meaning sitting down beside a person and staying until his hand had said everything it needed to say. A word can die on a wall for years, and then a single night can put the blood back in it. Priya Wren made charge nurse, and then she made something better than charge nurse, which was the person the new hires were quietly told to learn from. She never gave the speech about the medication cart. She had earned her nod a year after she started pulling those charts at night, and Odette had given it to her the way Odette gave everything, without ceremony, one sentence in a stairwell. "You kept going," Odette had said. "That is the whole of it. You kept going after the part where it stopped costing you something and started costing you more." And Priya had taken that the way you take a coin pressed into your hand by someone who has counted every one they own. And she had gone back to work, and she did not laugh at anyone on a medication cart ever again. And she stopped the newer ones when they tried. Fen Sato left nursing within the year. Some people the story does not tie a bow around, and Fen was one of them. She went into something quieter, a records office, a desk, a life with fewer chances to fail a person out loud. And whether that was cowardice or wisdom or simple honesty about her own weather, Odette never judged and never said. The door had been held open a few inches. Fen had looked through it and chosen a smaller room. That was allowed. Not everyone who witnesses a thing is changed into someone who can carry it, and pretending otherwise is just another way of lying about how much can be lost. Tobias Cuff kept the boilers running for 4 more years, and then his knees told him the weather one time too many, and he retired to a room with a view of the seawall, and the 4th floor sent him a card that half the staff had signed in Morse, dots and dashes filling the white space around the printed words, and he kept it on his windowsill where the salt light could reach it. When people came to visit him and asked, the way people do, about the famous night at Brackwater, the storm and the Admiral and the nurse, he would wave a knotted hand at the question as if clearing smoke. "They always want it loud," he would say. "They want the shouting. There wasn't any. That's the part they can't hold." He would look out at the water then, the flat gray reach of it going nowhere and everywhere at once. "She never raised her voice," he would say. "Not once in 6 years. Not in the dark with 9 ventilators dying. Not with a medal in front of her. Not with the man who threw her out kneeling at her feet. People think strength is the wave. Strength is the water under the wave. The wave is just the water getting tired." And when they asked what he had meant all those years, saying still water to a woman everyone else walked past, he would tell them the thing he had known. The first night he saw her cross a corridor, before an alarm had finished sounding. The thing it took the whole building 20 years and 1 storm to learn. "Still water don't advertise how deep it runs," he would say. "You only find out when something heavy goes into it, and it holds, and it carries that weight down gentle into the dark, and it keeps it safe, and it waits. It waits as long as it has to, and then one day the light comes right, and it brings the drowned thing up, whole, and lays it on the shore where you can finally see it was never lost at all, just held, just waiting on the light." Odette Marsh worked nights until her own hands began, at last, to slow, and even then she did not take days. "The ones who need finding get lost in the dark," she said. When they asked, and she said it the same flat way she said everything, And no one argued, because by then no one at Brackwater argued with her about where the work was. She kept the pilot's watch on her wrist. It ran a little fast, the way an old spring does once you have finally trusted it to move, gaining a minute a week, and she never corrected it. Because a watch that runs fast is a watch running towards something, and she had spent long enough with one stopped at 11 minutes past 4 to know the difference in her bones. They tell the story wrong now. They will always tell it wrong. They want the wave. But the old man who kept the boilers had the right of it, and so did the small square admiral who read a record into a silent hall, and so did the pilot who sent 3 words through the closing water, so a swimmer he could not save would live to save the rest. She was not the shout. She was never the shout. She was the deep, cold reach beneath it that takes the weight of every drowned thing and carries it gently, without a sound at the surface, all the way down and all the way through, until the day it can be brought up into the light. Still water, it runs deeper than you think. It always did.